Okay, so I'm going to talk about probably the first therapeutic compound known to man, alcohol. So I don't quite have a beard like that, but I am a brewer, run the NC State Brewery. And this research idea was actually first hatched by a man called Jonathan Frederick, and he runs the NC State Science Festival. So I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of knowing Jonathan, but he came to me one day with this idea that maybe we could make beer with wild yeast. And I said, well, maybe, but I'm not so sure about that. So why is that? Well, currently, if you look at commercial beer, 95% of all beer is made with two species of yeast. They're both from the genus Saccharomyces, and one is Cerevisiae. It's been around about 200 million years. And the reason it has such a longevity is because it makes ethanol. And it protects itself from predators that way. The other yeast, S. pasteurianus, is a relatively new yeast. It's probably about 600 years old. And it's the yeast responsible for lagers. So lager beer is actually a relatively new style of beer. And there's an interesting story about the origin of pasteurianus, but I won't have time right in this talk to go into that. Okay, so why are only two species of yeast used? Well, essentially, wild yeast have been considered contamination. Brewers don't want wild yeast in the beer. Why is that? Well, typically they do not ferment maltose very well. So maltose is the principal sugar used for making beer from malted barley. They don't utilize it very well, most wild yeast. They typically also give low ethanol yield. I mean, from the point of view of a brewer, the idea is to get maximum ethanol out of your sugar. Well, if your yeast is going to eat up the sugar and not give you much ethanol, it's not a very good yeast. Slow metabolism. Typically, wild yeast are not going to perform very well under brewery conditions. Brewery conditions, typically cooler, sort of like living in England. The temperature is kind of cool, not very susceptible to fast growth. So wild yeast typically like a little bit higher temperatures than used in the brewery. So that's not good either. They also produce a lot of nasty flavors and aromas. I don't know if some of you have had contaminated beer or drank contaminated beer. I always like the expression barnyard and horse blanket to represent some of these nasty flavors. So there's a lot of reasons why brewers really don't want wild yeast in their beer. So when I first came across this idea, I was pretty skeptical. Okay, so why then even bother looking at the use of novel yeast? Well, the reason is because of the very rapid increase in the craft brewing industry. There are now about 6,500 breweries in the US, and 6,500 breweries that probably make on average 10 different styles of beer each. That's 65,000 kinds of beer. That's a lot of competition. So in order to survive in a market like that, you want to have some kind of novelty. Okay, so what kind of novelty? Differentiate your products with new taste experiences. Also, you would like to produce premium products. That is something that can demand a higher profit margin, a little bit more revenue for your brewery. Most craft breweries, honestly, are not all that profitable. And if you're wanting to invest your money, you could probably look at some medical technology as being a little bit better investment. But anyway, it's a fun industry to be in. Okay, so differentiating products means new flavors, new tastes. How do you do that? Well, craft brewers have gone far away from the German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, which says there's only 3 main ingredients to beer, actually 4 now with yeast, but 3 originally. So brewers put a lot of different things in their beer now. You probably had some watermelon beer, sweet potato beer, all sorts of kinds of beer around. And this is all to differentiate the product. So putting these other ingredients in the beer does give you new taste sensation, but the other option is to use a novel yeast species, because in fact, yeast, especially with lager beers, are responsible for up to 40% of the flavor and aroma in the beer. So using novel yeast species is a way of differentiating product without having to use some of these strange ingredients. Okay, I already talked about that. So where are you going to get these wild yeast? Well, as it turns out, this project was undergone with someone called Dr. Ann Madden, who was an expert on the relationship between microorganisms and insects. And in fact, insects carry a lot of microorganisms with them. They transport them from plant to plant, from various different geographical areas to other geographical areas. So we decided to look at wasps and bees as possible sources of yeast. Once we had determined that there were actual yeast species present in the bees, we had to, first of all, isolate. Then we had to select the ones that could possibly make beer. After that, we had to identify. I'm the slowest of the bunch, oh my gosh. Then we had to do testing and more testing. It shows I'm a professor, right? Then we had to scale it up. Okay, so we had to try and show that this yeast could be commercialized. Okay, once we had done all that lab work, and I did this testing in the NC State Brewery where we have a 2.5 barrel system there, we had to convince the brewers that this was a good yeast. Well, that was not all that easy because brewing is a very traditional process. There's a lot of suspicion of new technologies. It's kind of like snake oil. You know, this is going to do something that nothing else can do. And breweries tend to be a bit have some risk aversion because of the probability of maybe contaminating all their other beer with some kind of foreign organism. Well, as it turns out, we were able to do that. And in fact, one of the breweries that uses my yeast is over to the right here. And that's Gizmo Brew Works as a commercial product using my yeast. So we have 4 local breweries using my wild yeast. And you're saying, well, why am they using my wild yeast when it does all those bad things? Well, it does one thing that is really unique, and it makes lactic acid. At the same time, it makes ethanol. So we can make sour beer in 3 weeks. And that's the big selling point to our technology. Thank you very much.
I don't know about anybody else, but I'm real thirsty after that talk. All right, first question over here.
You begged the question with your presentation. What happened 600 years ago? Why are there 2 types of yeast? And I mean, you know,
okay,
you could probably go on for 20 minutes, but maybe in 45 seconds.
Yeah, so it's kind of complicated. In Germany, they wanted to promote cold brewing technology because it was a big export market for German beer about 600 years ago throughout Europe, but beer spoiled very quickly. So they decided that if they made beer in a cold environment, that the beer was going to be more stable. And the reason for that is because there was less contamination by bacteria if they made it in a cold environment. So, but they selected for cryotolerant yeast when they did that, and was a yeast called Saccharomyces euverum that was first used for making lagers in that cold environment. Well, as it turns out, as they continued to use cold temperatures for brewing beer, what happened, there was a mating, you know, sounds kind of risque, but there was a mating in the brewery between Saccharomyces cerevisiae and what's another yeast called Saccharomyces eubayanus. Eubayanus and cerevisiae got together, and the offspring was Pasteurianus. So Pasteurianus is not actually culturable from the wild. It occurred in the brewery in some kind of a mating situation about 600 years ago. And we're not sure how that happened, but that's what happened.
We are officially in our first not safe for work RTP180 with yeast mating going on here. Next question, if you could stand up and ask your question, please.
Yeast from bees, are you getting any sort of honey flavor from that?
Great question. Did I plant you? So actually, yes. So one of the beers that we can make with this yeast is a blonde ale that actually tastes like honey, and I've had brewers swear that I put honey in it, and I don't. So it begs the question, where does the flavor of honey come from? Is it from bees or from yeast? So, yes, it's very interesting, but that does happen.
Any other questions on beer here? All right, we've got one in the back corner here. Saw your hand first. I will make my way over and around the slowest possible path I can take because I positioned myself poorly. All right, now we're here.
Where is it? Oh, there it is.
Thank you. Is your program for the public good, or the breweries get a profit from them?
Well, you know, when you work for the university, they're always out there to make some money. So they've actually patented these yeast species, and I started a company to license them from the university. So all my profits go to the university. So it's the way it works,
Questioning
right?
your business model here.
Well, I'm an academic. What do you expect, you know?
All right, last question will be coming here to your right. If you could stand up, please, and ask your question.
So I might have missed it. So what are the yeast species you're talking about, this wild yeast, for your new company? And is, you know, yeast species like Pichia pastoris type of thing also produces alcohol, or they don't?
Well, Pichia pasteuriana, Pichia I wouldn't use for making beer, but so the actual genus and species is called Lachancea thermotolerans, and it is a non-brewing strain. It's never been found in a brewery. It's not considered a contaminant, but it has been found in winemaking. So it is a naturally occurring species that, but is not previously been used in brewing.
And then my question to you is, with all this research into beer and yeast, what's your favorite style of beer?
My favorite style of beer, from a profit point of view or from a taste?
We've already established that profits are not really your strong suit, so
Yeah.
let's go with from a taste perspective.
Taste perspective, it's got to be Czech Pilsner.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay,
give it
thank
up
you.
for Dr. John Sheppard.